So this video is on adding questions into Schoology tests and quizzes that you're making. If you haven't already watched the video on creating the test and quiz and you don't know how to do that, then there's another video that comes before this, but this is specifically on how to add questions, and we're going to get into question banks. Okay, so once you've already created a quiz, or while you're creating the quiz, you're going to need to add questions. So here, this add question button, you have multiple choices of the way that you can add questions. The first choice is to just type the questions into the quiz right here. Maybe you already have this somewhere else on a piece of paper and you're just typing them in, or you're coming up with them out of your brain. You can do that. You have multiple choices on how to do that, and it's honestly very self-explanatory. So let's put in a true-false question. And you have true or false. The correct answer here is false. Make sure you pick the correct answer. The other thing that you can do here, it says require a correction if false. So let's say that I underlined this word and I want them, if it's false, so if it's false, I want them to type in the word that would replace the underlined word to make it a true statement. And I'm going to require a correction if false. The correct phrase that I am looking for is George. Now, the problem with this question as I've written it, and I know that this is a problem, is that even though I taught them about George and I want them to tell me George, and they should be able to tell me George, it is possible, since they may have some other prior knowledge, that they could answer something else. Maybe they're going to say Paul. So I'm actually going to make this a subjective question. I don't have to. If George is the only answer, they're not going to misspell it, or I've told them they have to spell it right, there's nothing else that they could put in, then Schoology will grade it for you. However, I know that this might cause some problems, so I'm going to make this a subjective question, which just means that I have to go back in and grade this particular question. It's not really that big of a deal, but the test, Schoology will grade all the other questions, but this particular one, it will make me grade before they get a final grade. Okay? And then timed question, if I want to give them a particular amount of time, points, and then I could also align my learning objectives if I wanted to put this to a particular teak about the Beatles. So one other thing here is show feedback. So if I wanted to, I could go back in and I could tell them, so the incorrect response, so now I've added some feedback for these particular questions. You don't have to do that, but you could if you wanted to let them know why they may have gotten something wrong, or that they got it right. Okay. Now I'm going to save this question. So I'm not going to go through all of the different questions. I will point out that unless you make them subjective, most of these will grade themselves, except for short answer essay. Those are subjective, and you'll have to go back in and you'll have to grade it. You can add a rubric to it to grade it. I'm not going to go into rubrics. There's various things that you can do in here, but short answer essay, you will have to go back and grade those yourself. The computer won't grade them for you, but it'll grade the rest of the questions in the quiz if there are any that aren't short answer. So now I want to talk to you about question banks. So you have the choice here to add questions from question banks. Now you have two choices, individual questions or random questions. So let's pick individual questions. Now I have created a bunch of different question banks for some of my content. So I want to choose individual questions. I want to pick the questions I want. So I'm going to go into this question bank, and let's say I want this question and this one, and then I'd like to throw that one in there. Okay, but I don't need the others. Over here are the points, and I'm going to make these all worth 1 point. You can make them worth different points if you want certain questions to be worth more. And I just hit add questions. And you can see here's the ones that I created, and here are the ones I just picked from those question banks. So that's if you want particular questions on there. But the other beauty of question banks is that you can pick random questions from the question banks. So I'm going to go back into those question banks. Now, of all these banks that I have for properties of matter, let's say I'd like questions about these 3 things. So I'm going to select from those question banks. Now, I have 7 questions that are about homogeneous and heterogeneous mixtures. I only want to put 2 questions on this quiz that are about that. I'm going to make them worth 1 point apiece. Now, of my 7 questions, it is going to randomly choose 2 of those questions. I'm going to only put 1 of my separating a mixture questions, 1 point. And again, I have 7 questions for physical and chemical properties, and I'd like to put 2 of those on there, 1 point. So now down here at the bottom, you can see from this question bank, I have 2 questions, and then I have 1 question, and then 2 questions from the third question bank. Now, here's why this is useful. If I were to let kids retake this quiz, this time they got these 2 questions, but when they retake it again, it will again randomly choose 2 questions. So each time they take a quiz, they can get a different quiz. It's really good for retakes. Also, if you have multiple kids in the same class, they will each get their own random sets of questions. They'll have the same number of questions from that bank, but they won't get the same question. Now, if you only have a couple of questions in each bank, then they will start repeating themselves, obviously. But if you start to build up, and it takes a while, but if you start to build up large question banks of similar questions, then you can have kids retaking quizzes, and you can have lots of kids in classes taking the same quizzes and getting different questions each time. And so that's really helping to check that mastery, because they're not actually memorizing the answers to the questions, because they're going to get a different question next time. So that's pretty much all there is to adding questions from the question banks. So now we have a complete quiz made. It's got 10 questions on it. You know that you can go back in. If you've watched the other video, you go back in and change all the different settings. But that is on the creating quizzes video, so I'm not going to go over that. And that's about it. Okay.